And there we are. We're live. We're live, Darren. We're still waiting for
Excellent.
Eric to join us. For anyone who might be watching, and there isn't, I don't see anyone watching right at the moment, but for anyone who might be tuning in, we're waiting for Eric to join us. And we were just being introduced to Darren's kitty, Princess. Now, Princess did not give us permission to use her name, right? Her name on the air. So apologies to Princess.
No worries. I'm sure she'll be fine.
Now, in our case, the cat who likes to get into the shot, as it were, is our female cat named Bubbles. Bubbles likes to join in on my wife's conference calls when she does her book club meetings on Thursday nights. And then let's see. I think we have two other cats. We have two boys. They're from the same litter, orange hair, and they are named Fred and George. Being red-haired, and you being in the UK, you may know where the names Fred and George came from, but that's what they're named.
Oh, that's a question. Can't say I know.
No, Fred
No,
and
no, go
George
for it.
Weasley. Fred and George Weasley.
Oh, okay.
Because
Excellent.
you can see right there, Potter. Yeah. So my rich with gold cousin in the UK never shares it with the family. Hoards it all. Never shares it.
Oh,
Hangs out with
like
his buds,
Scrooge
Fred
McDuck.
and George. Yes, Scrooge. Yes, Scrooge McDuck is more generous with family members than. Oh, speaking of Scrooge McDuck, Eric is joining us.
Excellent.
Oh. Hello. Hi, Darren. How are you?
There he is. Hiya. Hello there. Doing good.
Okay.
Doing good.
So,
That's good. I just realized I didn't have my headphones in, and give me shoot.
did you get a new mic, Eric?
I'm just like.
Oh, he doesn't have his headphones in. He just said that.
What?
I said, did you get a new mic?
No,
that mic
no.
is
This is the mic,
impressive, yeah.
same mic I've had.
It is. Oh, okay. Okay.
There we go.
That looks like
Now
a
I just have
Shure.
to make sure
Is that a
I
Shure?
can hear you. Give me 1 second.
Apparently, he can't hear me. He's making sure he can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you now. Sorry. All good.
Is that a Shure mic?
That is a Shure mic. Yes, it is.
It looks like a Shure mic. Yes.
Yeah, it does. It's not the it's the MV7, not their SM7B, their classic model. It's the one below that. But yeah, I've had it for a little while, but I got a better stand or mic arm for it.
Awesome. So we were just being introduced to Princess. Princess is busy giving Darren a mustache.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yes. And talking about... Now, you don't have any cats, do you, Eric?
No, not right now. No, we used to. Star used to be our cat, and she was a good cat.
Yep. Now, before we make this for cat's eyes only, we'll think about getting started here. We were doing a quick rundown before we went live. We're doing a quick rundown of the show, and Eric, it's kind of how we always do things. We have a little brief intro, and then introduce the two of you. Since it's been a little while since Darren has joined us, I was just kind of going over with him, the brief intro before we jump into the bullet points that I sent out earlier, that Darren sent out and I modified and sent back out again, because I just can't keep my mitts off of other people's work. So, yeah, that's where that is.
I thought what he sent out looked good to me.
It did look good. It looked
Yeah,
really good.
yeah.
And what did I have to do? I had to make
You had to
changes
change
to
it.
it, didn't I?
Yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Anywho, so I'll just have a little brief intro and then we'll jump into the bullet points. And I think kind of at that point, Darren's going to just go nuts and just lead us through the whole thing.
That sounds good.
Cool.
Kind of like Barry did. You know, Barry just went nuts with his Vision Pro. By the way, for those watching, and this won't be in the recording in the final episode of the show, but I've received some very nice compliments on that episode. Folks liked hearing it from, that first person perspective. Someone who just had a Vision Pro, has just been playing with it for a week. It wasn't a review. It was just what were Barry's experiences, and I've heard from a couple folks now who really enjoyed that, and that's nice to hear. Barry did a good job sharing, sharing how it worked for him.
He did, and it was really, really good. I thought it was really interesting, and I've seen some reviews on it. I've seen some other, but it actually, I think what's lacking is just kind of like the normal use, normal person using it and what their what their feeling is from it, and and how it works. And I thought that came across really well. I thought that was really good.
He did a good job with that, and he really does have a good use case scenario for it that he shared. And I don't know if that's applicable to everyone who might be interested in getting one, but certainly in his case, there were some good reasons for him to have it.
Right.
So yeah.
Yep.
How about you, Darren? I don't see you wearing a Vision Pro.
Oops, sorry, I was on mute.
Oh wait, you can't get it yet, can you? It's only in the US, isn't it?
Us poor people in the UK, we're not able to partake in the loveliness that is Vision Pro, unfortunately.
I forgot about that.
It's rather good. I've been looking in depth at quite a lot of the the videos, reviews, and so on, and also the how it works and the concept and so on. I think I'm extremely impressed with the user interface and interaction with the real world as opposed to what's been overlaid onto the real world. I think Apple's nailed it with the UI. I think so. It's very exciting stuff, but we're not able to take a look at all at the moment.
Exciting stuff, and quite possibly a future Gaming on the Mac episode.
Yeah,
indeed. Yes.
Yeah. Are you planning on getting one, Darren, when you do get a chance?
Sorry?
Or are you planning on getting one?
Probably not. No. Price wise, it's a bit a bit out of my league at the moment, I think. But, certainly very interested in the technology and how it works and so on. Not from a gaming point of view as such, because I don't do much in the way of VR gaming, but there was even an announcement today that relates to future Mac development in gaming and how it would possibly work in VR as well. So there's all sorts of moves afoot. So very interesting.
Yeah,
Definitely. Oh, it's for sure.
I was having a conversation about the Vision Pro with someone yesterday, and it, are you thinking about getting one? Well, no, for the very same reasons, among others. But the comment I had was, well, I could pay 3 months mortgage and keep a roof over my head, or I could buy a Vision Pro. That's kind of what it boils down to for me right now. So it's not in the cards. And I think a new iMac for the office and possibly a newer MacBook Pro would be a better use of the exact same funds.
I know. Yeah, that's kind of what came down for me too. Yeah. But think of it this way: if you did get a Vision Pro mic, you maybe wouldn't have a house, but you could think that you do. It would look like you did.
It would not matter that there was no roof over my head. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
I could just pretend. I could just
pretend. Be very happy living under the bridge with your Vision Pro on.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
The troll under the bridge. That's me. That's me.
Wow.
All right. Hey, and I did see in the chat room, it's Brian joining us today.
I saw that too.
And at least one other. But yeah, it's good to see Brian in there again. That's awesome.
I can't ever talk back. I mean, there's no way for me to. I can see the comments, but there's no way to actually reply.
There isn't a reply box? I thought you
No,
could.
I guess that's you. I think you have that ability, but not I.
You know what I intended to
not
do? I intended to, before we were recording today, to actually try this. You know, for anyone who hasn't used Ecamm Live, it's kind of there's two different ways of approaching it. There's my way, where I'm running the full Ecamm Live application on my Mac, and this is where I can, oh, it's Brett that's joining us. Hey, Brett. And this is where I can see you and switch scenes and, you know, do all the kind of stuff, make little adjustments to your camera like you are.
Right.
I can see the chat room. I can interact with the chat room. But then there's your side of it where you're accessing it via a web browser.
Right.
And I can set up and say, okay, you can see what's going out to the live stream within the browser there. And that's what you're seeing now. So if I make a switch, you know, to just me and you, or I make a switch to just me and Darren, you know, you see that switch happening. You can see the show going, and I thought you were supposed to be able to see the chat room and interact with it. Now you do have the interview chat, so you could send me a message through the interview chat, but I thought you could also do it through there, but I guess not. So I meant to try it. I meant to actually set up a faux interview between the two halves of my brain. One over here accessing it via Safari or Chrome.
Right.
And here, and just see what it looks like so I could actually better understand.
See, I was going to say, because
I never tried it, apparently.
Yeah.
So there you go. All right. Well, it is evening for Darren. I want to be respectful of his time.
Yes.
Make sure we're not keeping him too late. We won't do one of our 3-hour extravaganzas, Eric.
That sounds good.
I am going to point out for those watching, I am wearing an appropriate T-shirt for this conversation. See?
Excellent.
Oh,
yeah,
Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong.
Yes.
So I'm
retro
all
gaming.
set.
Excellent.
I put myself in the mood for a discussion on gaming. So
very
excellent.
There. Oh, Brian, look at this. Priorities, Brian. Come on.
I know. It sounds like he's got it right. It's
he's got it. No, I'm saying he's got it wrong. I mean, the priority here should be watching a live stream of absolutely no consequence to his life.
Right, exactly.
Versus participating in, you know, let's be honest, they're going to be boring meetings. Come on.
Yeah. Well, all meetings are boring.
This is going to be way more fun than those meetings are going to be, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Cognizant of Darren's time. Here we go. 1815. If I wrote down 1818, it would have been the year Illinois was founded as a state. So there you go. All right. We'll get started here. Oh, sure. He cancels his afternoon appointments for Mac Voices. Sure, but not. I get it. I understand. Yeah, Chuck has greater cachet than I do. I understand. No problems. No worries. All right. I'm going to get started. Just got to move my windows around. Sorry. Okay. He corrected himself. All right. In 3, 2, 1. It's For Mac Guys Only, episode number 427 for February 23rd, 2024. Ready Player Darren? Let me do that again. Ready Player Darren? Hey everyone, welcome back to For Mac Guys Only, the show for the Mac community where we share our thoughts and opinions on current Mac news and events. And joining me to talk Mac gaming is my For Mac Guys Only co-host, Eric Erickson. Howdy, Eric. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Mike? I'm looking forward to this. This definitely looks cool and long overdue too. Actually,
It's been a little while since we talked about this, hasn't it?
Yeah, a long time.
Speaking of a little while since we talked about this, I'm thrilled to welcome back to the show our special guest and Mac gaming enthusiast, Darren Davies. Welcome, Darren.
Hi there.
Nice to have you back. The last time we had this conversation was when you were on the show with us. So it's good to have you back. You can tell us everything you've learned since then. Now, with Eric and Darren in the group here, I did want to remind everyone we record For Mac Guys Only live on YouTube the second and fourth Friday of the month. And if you would like to come hang out, if you would like to ask questions and be part of our live studio audience, be sure to subscribe to the show at youtube.com/FMEOTV. Subscribing is free, by the way. I have had questions about that. There's no cost to subscribe. You just have to click that little subscribe button. And when you click the notification bell, you'll be alerted when we go live on YouTube. And if you are joining us live, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat room too. So if you have any questions or comments as we move along, be sure to preface it with a Q if you can, and we'll try to address it here on the show. Well, this episode does mark the third in a series of migration episodes for us. We began things with the great Evernote migration, moved on to file migrations, specifically Drobo to NAS, and now we're back with a topic that's quite possibly the trickiest of all to cover, and that's gaming on the Mac. And it's particularly tricky for those coming to the Mac from platforms known for higher-end gaming. And of course, by that I mean Windows. Now, I don't think it's unfair to say that the Mac isn't particularly known as a high-end gaming platform. The crowns for that go to Windows and, yes, to Linux as well, not only on the desktop, but also thanks to some awesome hardware like the Steam Deck. But it's certainly not for lack of power within Apple Silicon, nor is it for lack of trying on Apple's part. In fact, their latest efforts with the Game Porting Toolkit are probably one of its strongest pushes yet into gaming on the Mac, and it's probably the strongest push that they've made in quite a long time, especially from the developer perspective. Now, Eric and I have touched on it ever so briefly on the show before, but for those who haven't heard of it or aren't familiar with it, Apple's Game Porting Toolkit is probably best described as a translation layer. It pairs Wine with Apple's own D3D Metal, itself supporting DirectX 11 and 12. That's actually kind of key to some of our conversation we're going to have in a little bit. Yeah. Yep. And that combination provides an emulation environment for developers. Again, key to what we're talking about here. It provides an environment for developers to run their existing unmodified Windows games on the Mac and see how easy it might be to do a full port of that game over to the Mac operating system platform. Now, Darren has been wanting to join us again because he's been diving headlong into this world of gaming that's recently opened up for Mac users, and he's eager to share everything that he's learned so far since the last time he was on the show. But before we get too deep into the conversation, Darren, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to gaming on the Mac?
Well, specifically with gaming, yes. It's quite a long story how I started out in the Mac world. There's my cat's looking perfectly framed there.
Here's Princess.
Yeah.
There she is. I made mistakes earlier on, not knowing enough about the Mac. I was quite focused on x86 PCs, and I made the mistake of going into one of our local shops which had locked down their Macs so much that I couldn't evaluate whether buying one was a good idea. So it was only when I bought the stunning missing manual from David Pogue and read all about the wonderful intricacies of macOS and what it can do and how it works and so on, that I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is how computing should be done. This is how an OS should work. So that got me into my first foray into deciding to actually pull the lever and actually buy a Mac. And since then, it's been absolutely fantastic.
So when was that? What year are we talking here?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I think let's try and. I can't remember which Mac it was. It was an early iMac. It was Intel still then. I think it was around fair while ago. I think it was around 2006 or 8 or something like that.
That would seem. Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say that would probably jive with what I remember too, because I had a missing manual in 2003, and I think they were pretty big back then. David Pogue is an excellent author and writer. In fact, actually, when I had the same thing as you did, but in 1993, I bought my first Mac, and they didn't have the missing manual, but they had the For Dummies books back then, and David Pogue had written the Macs for Dummies, and I just thought that was so well written and just got me into the Mac hardcore. And so then when I had purchased a new one later on with OS 10, I got the missing manual, and yeah, it was just excellent book. And like you said, it's what computing should be. It really is.
That's it. Yeah, I started using Macs when OS 10 became a real thing. I think it was 10.4, I think. I'm not sure what era that is, but I think it was 10.4.
Tiger. Yeah.
Something like that. Or is it 10.3? So one of those, around that era.
Well, yeah. I'll admit I don't have a missing manual for the Mac, but I do have the missing manual for Photoshop CS6.
Yeah.
But I do have, this was actually a wonderful, wonderful series of books as well. I really loved all the books that No Starch Press puts out. And for a while there, I was writing reviews for an online Mac magazine. And one of the books that No Starch Press sent me to review is this one called My New Mac.
Oh,
cool.
This was actually a really nice series of books. This one happens to be the Lion edition that they sent me. And yes, I could easily grab it off my shelf there as we were talking. But yeah, both of these, I guess it's kind of rare these days to walk into a bookstore and pick up something like this. But when you can have something like a missing manual or the My New Mac book or what have you, here, listen to this, on the shelf in front of you, and you run into a problem that everything you need to know is right there in those books. And No Starch Press was an expert at that. Missing Manual is an expert at that. They both put out really, really good series of books.
Well, the thing I miss about the Missing Manual is, David's writing was one of the only sort of examples of going into the sort of depth that nobody else was writing about. And as an OS enthusiast myself, that was exactly what I needed to compare and contrast against other OSs that I was familiar with. And it got me really, really familiar with OS 10 before I ever touched an OS 10 machine. So it was absolutely pivotal to me, like starting out on my Mac journey. It was excellent.
And I think
unfortunately it's not made anymore, though. That's the only problem.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
For a lot of switchers, the period of time that you're talking about, 2005, 2006, is that pivotal period when the Mac switched from PowerPC to Intel. It made it much more practical for folks who were used to running Windows to adopt the Mac, because we had not only Boot
Yeah.
Camp, but we had all kinds of fantastic virtualization environments from, well, initially from Parallels and then later from VMware. I don't even know what's going to happen to VMware Fusion with all the brouhaha that's going on
Oh,
with
there's
VMware now.
but yeah, big issues happening at the moment in VMware land.
Yeah,
Lots of disgruntled customers, that's for sure.
especially that ESXi, getting rid of
Exactly.
that.
Yes, that's the
That
big one.
I use that myself in production for for quite some time. Anyway, so yeah, that was kind of that pivotal time, and the switch to Intel was huge for Apple in terms of bringing just an enormous number of switchers over to the platform.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, for sure.
speaking of gaming, Darren, this might be a little bit of an out there question, but what does it mean to you to be a gamer? It means something different to everyone. What does it mean
Oh,
to you?
wow. There's the question. It certainly does. Um, I uh, I wouldn't describe myself as a big gamer at the moment. There's a vast array of types of games that people can enjoy, and some people don't realise that they can enjoy those on the Mac as well, and they might assume that it's only for certain gaming, but that's not true. But personally, I very much like the as your shirt suggests there, I very much like the retro gaming side of things, and I also like console gaming, which is not terribly relevant to the Mac, but it sort of ties in a little bit with what's possible with the Apple TV, and possibly in future. But I used to be a very good Quake player, Quake 1, 2, and 3.
Mm.
I could pretty much thrash anyone that I came up against. I was very good at it. So now I'm able to enjoy those older games I used to play, including the game that was voted as the best game ever made, which is Half-Life 2.
Okay. Yeah.
It used to be we used to be able to play it on the Mac, Intel Macs, but since that was a 32-bit only game, that's made it very difficult for us to go. Even if we've already purchased it, which I had, very difficult for us to go back and replay an older game like that. Makes it hard. So now we have to look for other options to play games like that. But yeah, I was very much into Quake back in the day, and now with the advent of game engines, we can enjoy that on our Apple Silicon Macs now. We can play the original Windows Quake 1, 2, and 3, but with a replacement game engine, and the game is transformed. It's 10 times better than it was originally. So it's a win-win.
Now, hold that thought, because I know that's something you wanted to talk about in just a little bit. And the tools, the replacement game engines that you found to do this are amazing. So we'll get to that in just a moment. And I think you already answered this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So you were essentially a Windows gamer gone Mac who found themselves now wanting to play the same games in macOS that you loved on that other platform? Or
Exactly.
were you kind of always a multi-platform type person?
I've always been a little bit of a multi-platform, and adding the macOS into the mix let me spread my wings even further. But because macOS is essentially a fully ratified Linux, not Linux, sorry, I should say Unix machine. So it's not entirely the same as. It's not like another Linux distro. It is its own Unix OS.
Right.
So that means all my forays in Unix land back in the day matched up very nicely with my forays using the Mac and Unix in its macOS 10 flavor. So, kind of what I was going to say next.
It was a great decision on Apple's part to bring Next and Steve Jobs into the fold. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Switching to the Unix underpinnings for OS 10 seemed well. Look, every time they do something like this, we're like, "Oh my gosh, this is going to be a disaster." And then what happens? It turns out to be one of the best moves they ever made. And certainly, that switch
they pulled
to
the
OS
rabbit
10,
out of the hat with that one.
Oh, they did. They pulled the rabbit out of the hat with that one for sure. Yeah, it was a fantastic move. But we were a little leery at first, right?
Yeah.
And the switch, then the switch to Intel, and then the switch to Apple Silicon, and every one of these milestones in the Mac's development and in Mac OS and OS 10 and Mac OS development, we question it, but fortunately, so far, I feel as if we've been proven wrong every time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they took what was Berkeley Unix base.
BSD.
BSD.
Yeah.
Yep.
BSD, exactly. They turned that into a stunning Unix platform, and they've managed to do now two major architecture jumps, as you say, from PowerPC to Intel, and then from Intel to Apple Silicon. And Apple Silicon is very new to us all, and they did a quite good job with their first transition. But when they did their second transition, it was like fantastic. Nothing was wrong. They didn't put a foot wrong at all. So they've done a fantastic job on their second transition, learning from not many mistakes, but one or two small mistakes that they stumbled across when they did their first transition. But I mean, to give them their due, nobody's ever done a transition quite on that scale before. So even the first transition went quite well. But the second transition to Apple Silicon has been absolutely fantastic.
They truly went back to their notebooks from the PowerPC to Intel transition and said, all right, where did we fall a little short here? And they made sure that wasn't going to happen this time. And it hasn't. It's been super smooth, I'll have to admit. A couple things that I can't do any longer, and virtualization is one of them. Virtualization of x86 is one of them that you can quasi make work, but it just is not the same. And that's disappointing, but there are ways to work around that. But something like the game porting toolkit with the translation layers that they have to allow x86 games to run nearly seamlessly on the Mac is stunning. Now, Eric, we don't talk about gaming much on the show. I kind of get the sense that all three of us are kind of in the same boat, but what about you? Big gamer?
Me? You know what? I've gone back and forth. I love games, and initially when I got a computer, I did have a bunch of games, especially back in the day. And this, like when you mentioned retro gaming, but I've always, bought a game here and there all the way along. And although now it's been a few years, but I do have gaming consoles. So I do have a PlayStation, which I kind of ended up doing most of the gaming on there, and not so much on the Mac or even Windows. But I do love them. I'm always worried that I'm going to get carried away and spend all my time doing that. So then I guess I just didn't get into them as much as I probably could have, or even should have. But one thing that I think is kind of funny is that the Mac, right from the get-go, I don't know if the Mac suffered from not having many games just because of how it got its start, or I think they wanted to prove that it was such a a business machine or capable of doing serious productivity and everything else, that they, not that it didn't have games, but it just has never had the game support like Windows has had. And I just, I wonder if that was sort of intentional and then it just stuck, or how that, and I'm sure a big part of it was too, when you don't have the audience, when you don't have the number of users, it kind of stifles development for that sort of thing as well. But it now, the sort of, resurgence, and like you said, like Darren was saying, and even you had mentioned that Apple's really made it a point to try to get games over to the Mac, and I think this will be good. I think, I definitely, there's a number of games that I would like to try out myself and play around with. So I certainly am not. Don't shy away from it. Just haven't had the time and putting in the effort for it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the types of games that I really enjoy playing the most are, even if it's a modern game, are kind of old school format type games. I love 2D platformers. I'm not a big fan of 3D platformers, but I absolutely love 2D platformers. I love racing games. Those are the types of games I love the most. When it comes to first-person type shooters, FPS type games, I played a lot of Castle Wolfenstein 3D, and I played a lot of Doom. You talk about losing yourself in a game, Eric. I played a lot of Doom. And then Quake came along, and Darren, you're a big Quake fan, but I just couldn't enjoy it as much. And part of it is because I love the much simpler control system of Doom. And before it, Castle Wolfenstein 3D, because there was a 2D platformer, Castle Wolfenstein. So, let's make sure we clarify that. Castle Wolfenstein 3D. I love the much simpler control system. Turn, run, point, shoot. You don't have to aim. You don't have to worry about who's up there. It's like you just you get your frustrations out in one go, and you don't have to dig too deeply into the control system of it. But if I sit down now to play a game, and keep in mind, I dutifully, every week, I go to Epic Games and I grab their free game of the week. I go to Steam and I grab the free games. I go to Amazon Gaming and I grab the free games. And they, they're part of my account. GOG, good old games. I grab those free games when they offer them. Do I play them? No, I don't necessarily. But a lot of times the game that they offer is something like, oh, I would really enjoy that one. It's a racing game, or it's a modern 2D platformer or something like that. Or sometimes it's a retro 2D platformer. But those are the games I gravitate to pretty consistently. So I don't really enjoy the super complicated first-person shooter type games. And to me, the blood and gore of Doom, or even of Quake, is enough. I don't need super detailed, rich, let's watch this person's head explode. I don't need that. I don't need that.
Right. No, I don't either.
But I don't mind shooting a few aliens in Doom.
Zombies.
That's fine. Yeah. Or zombies. Or
Zombies.
Or Nazis in Castle Wolfenstein 3D. That's fine too. Nazi robots or whatever it is in Castle Wolfenstein.
Nazi robot zombies.
There you go. Nazi robot zombies. There you go. So that's kind of what I gravitate towards. Now, why don't we get into the discussion? We've kind of been dancing around this. I want to kind of let Darren take the lead here. Why don't we start with how Apple's silicon architecture is different than where we might be coming from? We're talking about migrating, so we're kind of saying, all right, migrating from what? Windows, or migrating from, Linux maybe. But when we're talking about migrating from that architecture to Apple's new Apple Silicon architecture. How is it different, Darren?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, to be fair, we've actually been used to a particular type of architecture for the last 30 years, and it hasn't changed much.
No.
So in, as an overview and massively oversimplifying things, the x86 architecture that people have been traditionally used to, and this goes especially for people who build their own systems and gaming rigs and so on. They're used to an 86 system, a motherboard, RAM sitting on that board, processor sitting on the motherboard.
Right.
They both talk. They talk through a bus, so the CPU can't talk to the RAM unless it goes through the bus. So there's a bus in the way. There's always a bus in the way. And there's a graphics card sitting on that motherboard as well, which also communicates through the bus. And also, the graphics card has to have its own dedicated RAM. It can't use the RAM that's on the system board. So that means the CPU has to copy data from the RAM across the bus to the graphics card and back again. It does this cycle quite a lot where data is flowing around the system, and it all goes through this bus. So fundamentally, when Apple Silicon was announced, I mean, personally, I didn't know much about Apple Silicon when it was first promoted, well, not promoted as such, but announced. And I remember Johnny Sarugi and his wonderful Apple team popped up on one of the Mac developer shows and started to explain what Apple Silicon was all about. And it was a real departure from what we've been used to for the last 30 years. So I found it extremely impressive myself. And essentially, the big difference is there is no internal bus as such.
Right.
The Apple Silicon devices don't have a motherboard where the processor and RAM and graphics systems sit individually and have to communicate through a bus to do things with each other. They all sit on a SoC, a system on chip. So essentially, the one chip is the whole computer. So there are CPU cores on there in a very nice big little architecture that's also different to most x86 processors, which, funnily enough, Intel is trying to adopt now as well to take some of the ideas from Apple Silicon, but they'll never quite produce something as similar or as good as that unless they adopt the whole idea of the different architecture.
Right.
So with the Mac, the CPU cores can interact with the RAM directly because it's on the same chip, and the GPU cores are on the same chip with the RAM and the CPU cores and the machine learning cores, and they can all access and share the same memory, which is the unified memory architecture. And this means that the RAM is shared between the CPU, and it can access the entire amount of RAM, no limitation. And the GPU can also access the entire amount of RAM with no limitation, and it's the same RAM. So you can, in effect, the CPU can alter the RAM contents whilst the GPU is looking at the same area of RAM at that RAM contents and using that in real time. So there are no memory copies. You don't have to go around this loop of multiple memory copies back and forth between RAM and GPU to achieve the same things that you would have to on an 86-based system. So it's entirely, it's an alien platform, essentially. It's a little bit like a PS3. So not in how it works, but for instance, when Sony introduced the PS3, developers did have a little bit of trouble thinking, oh, this is nothing like the PS2 that I'm used to. I have to think differently about programming this, and this is what developers will need to think about when they start developing for Apple Silicon. They have to think different a little bit to to properly program the new architecture. So they have to sort of get out of their own mindset a little bit when they're so used to 30 years of 8.6 based programming. They have to think, well, I need to approach this differently and program specifically to the Apple Silicon architecture using the also there's a very new way of programming the graphics pipeline. So that's what developers really need to take on board when they're making ports for their Windows games. And some developers aren't too keen about doing this because it's extra work, of course. For a smaller market, as Eric was saying, the market is a lot smaller for potential Mac game purchasers. But it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation because the market is smaller because the games aren't available, and the games aren't available because the market is smaller.
It's smaller.
So you're a bit stuck there. So yeah, it's difficult. I understand it's difficult for developers because their main focus is making money. So they have to put in extra work to make a port of a game that they've already made for Windows for a smaller market. But I don't think that's a huge problem, really, because they've already done 99% of the hard work producing all the game assets and everything else that you would use in the game. And those game assets are completely directly transferable to the Mac port. So there's not much extra work to do. All the developer has to do is make a new game engine to replace the executable that the Windows executable would run to run the game. So it's only the game engine they need. So I think all the developers need to do really is to give themselves an extra month or so, contact Apple and say, can you lend me a hand working out this new architecture and graphics pipeline? And then they've got a Mac port that they could increase their sales with. And even more strangely, when Windows developers do produce a native Mac port that's very good, they tend to get a lot of press coverage about it and a lot of interest, which actually then improves their Windows game sales. So it's a win-win.
It is a win-win, but as you're describing all this, I'm thinking, okay, so chicken and egg scenario, but is it fair to ask developers that have this huge market of potential Windows players, is it fair to ask them to say, now you need to develop a version of this for the Mac or for Linux or for whatever other platform wants to have this game hosted upon it? So it seems as if Apple very smartly with the game porting toolkit said, aha, look what Steam is doing. Look what Steam is doing with Proton.
Indeed.
You know, let's see if we can do something similar to that to not only encourage developers to look our way, but to make it as easy as possible for them to allow
make it
that
easy
game
for the developers.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where perhaps, and I believe this is the case for most of the games that run well on Linux through Steam, there's very little effort at all on the developer's part to make that happen. The effort is on Steam's part to assure that happens. And it seems as if
essentially
Game Porting Toolkit is Apple's way of saying, we're going to do the same thing for you. You don't have to put much effort at all into this. We just want to make sure that your game works and works well. Does that seem like a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I can see why it wouldn't make financial sense for a lot of developers to develop every single product as a cross-platform. Sorry, I've got a cat issue there. But having said that, I think it would be important for developers to choose their key game that they've been working on, for instance, and make a Mac port for that, which also ties in with making it compatible or better able to run on Linux through Proton, for instance, for the Steam Deck. That same work that they would do to improve the compatibility to make a Mac engine would be the same sort of work that they would do to make it work directly in Linux.
If I understand it, it's nearly identical, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about wine in both cases.
Well, yes and no, because we're sort of talking about two different things slightly. The game porting toolkit is for use by developers, and where end customers are also using it indirectly through, for instance, crossover.
Right.
But that's a translator, as you said, that's a translation layer, so that developers can get an idea how their existing Windows application unmodified will run. But the way the Proton layer works is very similar to that, and the way crossover works. So crossover and Proton are quite similar. They both encompass wine, and they both encompass DirectX translations to for instance, Metal, Vulkan VK, that sort of thing. But they're not ports. So on the one hand, there's migrating your Mac, your Windows application to run on the Mac as a ported application, and there's another way of running that Windows game completely unmodified through a translation layer, which is like crossover and Proton and so on.
Okay. Yeah, and that was kind of what I was
So
referring to.
They're both different things. So one enables a developer to help them translate their game into a native port, and the other one is to run the Windows game unmodified on a system that doesn't have that game available. So it's two slightly different things, but they are related.
Yeah, and you put this in your notes, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your toes here when I say this, but I think it's interesting to point out what it means to run a game through these translation layers. As you pointed out, we're taking Intel x86, /64 code, and it's being translated to ARM code. Windows systems calls, because if it's a native Windows app, those I'm sorry, I have to unmute Eric here, if I can. Oh, they muted.
No
okay,
worries.
Eric muted. All right, here we go. But
that's right. Yes.
If it's a Windows application you're trying to run by way of Wine or Crossover or Proton or whatever, the Windows system calls have to be translated into macOS system calls. And then, as you mentioned, DirectX needs to be translated to Metal. There's a heck of a lot of work going on here.
Yeah. So, and all those three translations running in real time, they happen in mere tens of milliseconds.
It's crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's astonishing. The game will go around its main loop, running these translations in real time, just a few milliseconds, and you can still, even though it's doing such a hard amount of work, that the Mac is working overtime there, translating a piece of software that was never ever designed to run on the system at all.
Right.
In theory, it should have no hope of running. It should be impossible. But it's one of these things that that there's a guy called who's got a great YouTube channel called Modern Vintage Gamer, and it's not a port as such, but in a way it's like one of his impossible ports that he talks about, where systems run so well ported and having a game ported to it that it seems like it would be impossible to run on that hardware. So it seems in a very similar way that the Mac is able to run a completely unmodified Windows game with the wrong processor and
the wrong architecture,
and the wrong architecture, and the wrong graphics pipeline. And it still manages to do that and have a playable game at the end of it. It's like, it's incredible, absolutely incredible.
That's what I was going to say. It's still very playable.
Yeah.
And it's playable. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, up to even 30 frames per second or so, even on a lower end M1 based Mac like mine. Mine is quite low end. Mine's nearly at the bottom of performance levels, and you can still get up to 25, 30 frames per second running a Windows game. It's like, this shouldn't be possible.
No, you're exactly right. It shouldn't be possible. I mean, it's amazing that it is. Actually, it really is. And I think the thing is too, we're talking about games, something that, software that pushes not only the CPU but the GPU as well. And we're not talking about a word processor or
Yes.
a spreadsheet or whatever. This is something that actually requires power, and actually requires resources as well as RAM. And so it's amazing that it works at all, let alone as well as it does. Yeah,
it's the incredible game loop. The game loop is incredibly tight, and it's just going around this loop, testing for the player. What's the player doing? Very reactive, very, very close on timing. Producing something like a spreadsheet for any computer is absolutely walk in the park.
Right.
Running any game is a tremendous challenge for the best programmers in the world are games programmers.
Right.
It's just how it is.
Yeah. In fact, I think a lot of C++ and all that stuff, I don't know if it still is, but I think it's always been still used by gamers and just about any level
speed
language. Yeah, that's got the speed. In fact, I forget what it was. This has been quite a while ago now, but the game, I think it was Roller Coaster Tycoon back in the day, but a lot of it was written in assembler just because it was the only way it could be done.
It was too slow.
That it would run. Yeah. Like you said, games programmers are the best programmers in the world because they're really coding almost bit for bit. It's not just pushing frameworks or this or that. They're really breaking new ground a lot of times.
I think there's only one type of programmer that is better than a games programmer, and that's an emulator programmer who emulates another system to run another game.
Right.
They're the pinnacle. If you want to learn programming, learn to write an emulator, and you can write absolutely anything. The world
right, absolutely everything. Yeah.
We can talk about this in a little bit when we discuss retro gaming, but some of the best games written back in the day were written purely in Z80 assembler, 6502 assembler. You have to remember, you had maybe 16K, maybe 48K, maybe 64K of memory, total memory to load this game into. Sure, some games were written in BASIC. Some games, that's about it. BASIC and assembler, that was what they were written in. And if you really wanted to push machines to their limit, it had to be an assembler.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, we can talk about that in a bit. Now, we danced around this again a little bit, but, we talked about Game Porting Toolkit and how that helps developers. But what are some of the tools that end users can use, Darren, that would allow them to perhaps directly run an unmodified Windows game on their Mac right now?
Right. Well, the two favorites are Crossover and Whisky. Crossover is a fantastic app. In fact, hats off to the guys who create Crossover. They make use of technologies by some other guys we should take our hats off to as well. The developers of Wine and
absolutely
the Wine project, and also the developers of people who make the DirectX translation layers to Metal, for instance. They're all packaged up and used within Crossover to make it easy, because normally because you can set this all up manually yourself, but you pretty much have to go to night school for 2 years before you can figure out how to install it. So it's It's pretty tricky.
Wine, you mean?
So
Wine.
yes, if you were to
Yeah.
install Wine yourself and
Yeah.
figure out how to create all of the bottles manually, where to place files, how the structure works, patching this, that, and the other, putting graphics overlays in, and making one product talk to another product. It's the thing that Crossover has developed. They're making use of open source tools, but they've put it together in such a way to make it incredibly easy for the user. So the user can just go and buy a copy of Crossover.
Yeah.
It is fairly expensive in a way, but when you pay yearly, it's not too bad. And there is a lifetime license, which if you are wanting to play or dabble a lot in playing unmodified Windows games on a Mac, I'd say the price is well worth it to go down the Crossover route. But there is a free variant of Crossover called Whisky, which uses the same technologies. It uses Wine, it uses DirectX to metal translation layers and so on. But obviously there's hardly any support there, although you can find your own support on the forums and so on, but there's a lot more involved. With Crossover, the developers are very nice and friendly. For instance, if you have a problem getting a game to run, you can contact them. They have an extensive list of games that they say, oh, this Windows game will run in a perfect way through Crossover. And any game not listed on there, you can give it a good go. It was likely to work. It would probably work. There are a few notable exceptions of some older games that don't want to work, and issues with some developers that have used anti-cheat software, which causes big problems.
That causes problems, yeah.
Absolutely. But the Crossover guys will be very happy to try to help you make your game work in Crossover, especially if it's not on their list, because it's in their interests as well. So when they help you to get your game running, they gather information that they can put back on their website to say this game is supported under Crossover and here's what you need to set to get it to work. So again, it's another win-win. It's the Crossover guys get information from games that don't run, and you as a customer wanting to run an unmodified game get some expert help from the Crossover guys to get it to work. So it's good.
Well, I will say this for the folks at Codeweavers. Codeweavers is the company that releases Crossover.
Yeah.
I have had a subscription. Well, it's not a subscription, really. I've had a license for Crossover for a long time now. And they just released version 24 yesterday. And it's amazing because Wine 9 was just released about a month ago. And as they point out, they don't, this isn't boasted on their homepage. You have to kind of dig around to find the article that says this, but they point out this was the fastest turnaround for a new release of Crossover based on a new release of Wine ever.
Yeah, it's very impressive.
1 month, very impressive. And there's a lot of impressive stuff in Wine 9 as well. I don't know if you had any plans to talk about that, but one thing I wanted to point out, you talked about how easy Codeweavers is to work with, and I have to say they often run sales. Their initial price to buy into Crossover is about $75, I think it is, in US dollars. And the renewal works out to be about $34 a year, something like that. Or $34 it's a year, $34 a year. But it's not a subscription because if you don't renew it, you just keep using the version that you have. But what they offered yesterday when they released version 24, what they offered yesterday, because of Wine 9 having just been released, they said, hey, you can take 24% off any license. You're shaking your head, so I know you did this. Any license or any upgrade. So I had just renewed mine in January and got this offer, and I said, well, let me see if I can do this. I clicked renew, got the 24% off the renewal, and now my license is good through February 2026 at an additional discount. I mean, that's a very generous offer to offer that kind of discount on a renewal as well. So I just had to put that out there. If you're interested in it, you should absolutely check them out. It's great to support them because they themselves put so much back into the open source community.
That's it. What they develop goes back into the open source. Yes. I'd also recommend there's a YouTube channel for a Mac gaming developer that also does some very, very in-depth information about Mac gaming, especially with crossover. He's called Andrew Tsai. I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's TSAI. And he regularly has coupon codes available to get discounts with crossover through watching one of his latest shows. So when you watch one of his shows, he'll give you a discount code for crossover, and it's quite generous. So that's another way of getting discounts on crossover.
That's a great way to buy into it. And I'll also point out that my license for crossover, and I correct me if I'm wrong on this, Darren, but my license anywhere for crossover allows me to download the version of crossover for the Mac, as well as the version of crossover for Linux.
For Linux as well, indeed. Yep. Yes.
Which is fantastic.
It is.
Now, crossover is great. I think it's wonderful to buy that and support the open source community by way of their efforts. It certainly makes things like Game Porting Toolkit better, because crossover
it integrates that as well. Actually, crossover does integrate that completely too.
It does, which is phenomenal. Now, how does Whisky differ? I know you said it's kind of the quote free version. It's a version you can download, and I'll admit I did download it and I played it, I ran it, and one of the things that impressed me is as you install it, it checks to see if you have Rosetta already installed and will offer to install it for you. And it checks to see if you have the Game Porting Toolkit installed and will install it for you as part of the setup process for Whisky.
Yes.
That's great.
That is very handy. That is great, actually, yes, because if you saw the early days of the Game Porting Toolkit and what the installation method was.
It was rough.
It was rough. You had to run like 790 terminal commands and understand physics backwards to be able to install it.
I think you needed 2 doctorates, didn't you?
Yeah. So like you say, Whisky makes that easy. So it integrates Game Porting Toolkit. It integrates Wine. I'm not sure how quick they are to adopt things like the latest Wine 9, for instance, but they integrate the same things that crossover does. It's just with crossover you've got a lot more support there and a lot more compatibility because the crossover guys have tested a vast range of games and how well they run, and they've graded them and all of that. So that's the sort of thing that's missing with Whisky. So if you're feeling you don't have to be particularly brave, not a little bit adventurous maybe, by all means pop down the Whisky route and try these things out, because nothing can go wrong. You just can see if the things that you want to run will run, and if you decide that's a really good thing, you may choose to upgrade to crossover later on. But you could always start off happily with Whisky because they sort of tie into each other nicely.
And I'm going to point out, I was going to mention this, but you just gave me the perfect lead in for it. If you click through. No, it's good. It's good. If you click through to Whisky's GitHub page, on their page, they specifically say Whisky does not exist without crossover. And that they encourage people, they absolutely encourage people to support the work of crossover by using Whisky's affiliate link. Now, it's important to point out it is an affiliate link. So what happens when you click that link is they're going to get a little kickback from your purchase, and of course crossover is going to get the support from you buying the product from them. But that's great. it's as it should be. You should acknowledge those upon whose shoulders you're standing. And Whisky is standing upon the shoulders of Crossover and, of course, Wine in order to make their project successful. So, all that said, Whisky, Crossover, I feel as if the process you have to go through to run a Windows native app, not a Mac native app, a Windows native app, using Whisky or Crossover is pretty much the same. But why don't you step through briefly what that process is? How, you know, you don't have to get into a whole lot of detail, but what is the process of installing? Let's use Quake as an example. Quake in Whisky or Crossover.
Sure, yeah, no worries. In that example, although you probably wouldn't do that for Quake, because there is a very nice
me here, Darren.
There's a very good game engine, replacement game engine that you could use for that. But yeah,
okay, I'll let you pick the game you want to install then.
Okay, say oh dear, that's difficult. Well, say for instance the one we talked about earlier on, Half-Life 2.
There you go. Okay.
Which you can't really play anymore very easily on the Mac, because the only Mac version is 32-bit and worked on Intel only. Intel would translate happily through Rosetta, no worries, but it doesn't support 32-bit anymore, and Valve in their infinite wisdom can't really be bothered to make a 64-bit version, which is very, very disappointing.
It is disappointing, yeah.
Yeah.
So in that case, running the Windows version is a perfect example of what you would want to do through Crossover. So the way you would do it is you buy a copy of Crossover, you run that, and the first thing you do is you can search for Windows apps that have been pre-configured and are well known to Crossover how to set up automatically. They've got automatic scripts in there to set certain things up. A little bit like how Lutris sets up games on Linux as well, because there's known scripts. So, for instance, you just search for Steam. It'll go off and find the Windows download for Steam and download that as a Windows app through the Crossover layer. So far as the Steam installer understands, it's running on a PC. It's fooled very nicely into thinking, oh, I'm a PC, but it's actually on a Mac. It doesn't know. So the Windows installer for Steam runs, and it runs inside a bottle that Crossover automatically creates. So it creates a bottle container, which is a virtual PC hard disk. But it also virtualizes the PC's registry and other bits and pieces that are usually alien, so that when the installer runs, it thinks, oh, there's a registry there, I must be on a Windows machine, but it's not. So the Windows installer happily runs, writes its file to this pretend container, which is a PC hard disk it thinks it can see, but it's not there, and it writes its registry entries to a registry that also isn't there, but is gathered by Crossover and put into a virtual registry holder for that bottle. So essentially, that bottle is a little PC emulator in a way, almost. You could sort of think of it like that. Although it's a translator, it's a little bit like that. So then, once you run the copy of Steam from inside Crossover, you're actually running the Windows copy of Steam, not the Mac version of Steam. So then all of your Windows Steam games show up, and you just click and install them as you normally would. The installer for the game, for instance, Half-Life 2 in this case, would see the pretend hard disk and the registry that's inside that bottle that Crossover has created for it. So far as it's concerned, it's installing on a PC, which it's not. But it puts all the files into the right places, puts the executable in there for you to then run that executable from the bottle that Steam adds inside that bottle for that game. And you can create multiple bottles for different games, because sometimes different settings work better for different games. So you can have one bottle for all your games, or you could have an individual bottle for each game. And there's not too much of an overhead, because remember, it doesn't have to run an entire copy of Windows for each game. If you do multiply it up like that, it's only the definitions of where the individual registry is and where the individual files go in an emulated file system. So it's not the same as multiplying up several copies of Windows if you want to run an individual game in an individual bottle. So you can set up multiple bottles, and that lets you set up individual settings for each game if you want to, and that can be quite useful. So that's how you set up Half-Life 2 to run on a Mac.
That's awesome.
Running the unmodified Windows game.
Now I have two comments, because somebody's going to point this out, so I just want to make sure we clarify things here. You mentioned, and you also said it's not really, but you mentioned Wine is kind of an emulator, right? And it's not
Wine
really.
Wine is not an emulator.
Wine is not an emulator. So the acronym Wine in this wonderfully humorous world of open source software, which I absolutely love, Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And then two, you used the term bottles. And I just wanted to clarify that too. These containers that we're building are called bottles because the project is called Wine. So these are wine bottles.
Wine bottles, right? Of course.
I just wanted to, if anybody was confused why these containers might be called bottles, that's why.
That's where wine goes.
Yes.
Sort of like homebrew and caskets and,
there you go.
Yeah, kegs and all that.
Yep, exactly.
I wanted to ask, sorry if I missed this, but so you've got Whisky or Crossover, you're going to run whatever game, and you want to install it. Does that need? Do you basically, is Crossover running in the background, or is it running in the foreground? And you open up the game. I'm assuming it's like an exe file or something like that, or some sort of installer.
Yeah.
File.
Yeah, it runs inside. Yeah, you're right. Crossover is running all the time, although it's sort of passing calls from one place to another. So it's not necessarily in overall control. It's just gathering a call, a system call or something, and then pointing it to where it should be pointed, so that the software running thinks it's running on a PC when it isn't. So it's sort of like redirecting, it's call redirector. So it is running in the background all the time, but there's not a massive overhead. I think it takes about 2 to 5% or something like that processor. Not even
that's
that,
not
probably.
Bad. Yeah.
And
that's
just to clarify, and by the way, Crossover can be used for more than just gaming. It can be used to run.
Oh yes.
Business applications and CAD and all that kind of stuff. You can do that with Crossover. Just to clarify, Crossover is running all the time while you are running the Windows application. It's not necessarily running all the time. At boot up.
Only during the Windows
right.
application.
So it's not something that's going to be taking resources from your Mac when you're not running.
Oh, not
Windows
at all.
game.
No.
Right.
Only when you decide to run the game is it in memory doing things. But once you close out of the game, you essentially also close out of Crossover, and
exactly.
There's no overhead.
Okay, you wouldn't let me install Quake through Crossover. But that's because you had a very good reason for not allowing me to install Quake through Crossover. And that's because there are these, I believe they're also open source game engines that allow you to take in Doom and Quake nomenclature, the WAD files or the level files from the games and run them directly on the Mac by way of these new game engines. So how do you run Quake then? How do you run Quake then, Darren?
Right. Well, this is the easiest option. There's a website called the Apple Gaming Wiki, which is essential viewing if you have an older game you want to run. if your game is listed on that page, then you're in luck, because you often find that there is a replacement game engine, and the way that works is you can take your existing copy of your Windows game and just pop it onto a folder on your Mac. Any old place will do, doesn't matter. I think anything's fine. And in that folder, you'll notice there's a .exe file, which is the Windows game executable, which is the game engine. So when you replace that game engine for a Apple Silicon native game engine, you simply run that instead, and it points to the same files, the same Windows game files, and uses those to run the game. So all you're doing is you're replacing the Windows game engine with a Mac game engine. You can leave the XE there, it's usually quite small. It doesn't really matter whether you delete it or use it, but you're just doing a replacement. You're replacing the Windows game engine for an Apple Silicon native game engine. And when you do that, the game will get a new life. It'll run 10 times better than it ever did on a Windows machine, and you'll see an incredible boost in performance. So some games you would play on an Intel Mac or an Intel x86 PC, and you would get like say 60, 80 frames per second or something. And think, well, that's really rather good. But then when you replace the game engine with an Apple Silicon native game engine and use the same files to run the game that way, you can see, it'll go up to 270 frames per second instead. And you think, oh my God. And it'll be so smooth and such a better experience. And in fact, a lot of the game engines also now, since it's so fast, running older games, it can introduce more graphics. For instance, you can have more particle effects, you can have better explosions, you can have better textures, better quality textures. You can even download some texture replacement packs for older games to replace the older 16-bit textures they used to have in the game, and you can replace them with 64-bit textures, much higher definition. That the original machines, the original Windows machines that it was developed for, didn't have enough graphics memory to cope with. But this goes back nicely to the architecture, because the Apple Silicon architecture has shared unified memory. Effectively, the graphics memory is unlimited now. So back in the day, the PC game would have had a very small, limited amount of graphics memory to deal with and have to fit their textures within that. Whereas now, with the unified memory architecture, there is no limit to texture memory, because it's the whole of the system memory. So in effect, your graphics card, you think you may be doing well on a PC to have a 64 gig graphics card or something, but it's nothing if you've got if you've got like 128 gig RAM or more,
right?
Because that amount of RAM is also graphics RAM.
Is available for the graphics on the graphics card as well. Yeah,
that's it.
And I wanted to ask,
on an 8.6 architecture, that's not possible. That's right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What was I thinking? So the crossover, it now, I think I remember right. Do they need to? And I think you kind of said this at the beginning too. Was the particular game or app, whatever it is, needs to be able to run on there. Not every single Windows application will be able to run in crossover. Is that correct?
That's right. There's various levels of compatibility. They've got a nice thing on their website to tell you what the grading for a particular game is. Some games are platinum, some are gold, which run perfectly. Some are bronze, and some are a bit of coal that's fallen off the edge and unable to run. And some of those games, it's ironic actually, because some of those games would actually run perfectly fine. It's just some developers are a bit naughty, possibly a bit lazy, and they've bought an off-the-shelf anti-cheat system, which they didn't bother to check whether it's cross-platform or not.
No.
And they just buy it and they add it to their game, And without that anti-cheat, their game would probably run perfectly fine on the Mac and run on Linux with no worries. But because of that anti-cheat, that stops the whole shebang and stops it running on Linux and stops it running on Mac. And that's the fault of the developers, really, not making sure that the plugins they get or the additions they get to add to their games are suitable for multi-platform. It's just awareness, really. Developers need to be a bit more aware about how their customers may want to run their game. Traditionally, a developer would have been sure that their customer would only ever want to run it on Windows, but that's no longer the case. So they just need to widen their field of view for their potential customers, really. That's what I think, anyway.
And you know, the catalog of available applications that you can run on the Mac by way of, or Linux by way of crossover, is a phenomenal feature of crossover. And there's a similar catalog on the Wine HQ site, if I recall.
Yes, that's right.
And I believe they feed off of each other. So as crossover contributes to the Wine project and Wine makes their own changes, that catalog gets updated all the time. But it's important to note too, and this is just kind of a little humorous anecdote here, but it's important to note too that even games that aren't on the approved list and might be some of the most obscure games or applications you've ever come across may run fine in crossover. And the example that I have is something, talk about wasting time playing games. When I used to work for a support company back in the 90s, we played a game on the network all the time called PacWars. And it was written in such a way that you could play against each other. As a multiplayer game, you could play against each other on the local network over a Novell network. It had to be a Novell network. It was not written for, TCP network. It had to be a Novell network. Well, I love that game and I miss that game. I don't have anyone to play against with that game, but I found somebody who created another version of it many years ago. I think like a decade and a half now. They created another version of it that works over what we would consider a modern networking infrastructure, and released it. Now this was a DOS game, ran on DOS over Novell networks. It's been modified. I've been able to successfully install not only that game, but the game server on my Mac by way of crossover.
Very good.
The Mac heats up like a son of a gun playing it, but it works. So even some of the most obscure things you can think of may very well work
anyway.
Oh yeah, it's worth giving them a try. Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's absolutely worth giving it a try. Anyway.
and something like that, I mean, we're talking about a few $100K at most for this game, and so it's not going to take up a lot of space on your Mac to try it. Now, I did want to go back to the game engines for just a moment, because you showed something to me that just blew my mind. When we played Quake, when we played Doom, we thought of them as 3D games, but let's be honest, they're not really 3D games. Everything is flat. When you're coming across that boss in the boss level, that's a flat 2D image.
Yeah. It's a visual trick.
It's a visual trick. As you run around that boss, you're seeing the exact same viewpoint of it, no matter where you are, right?
Yeah.
Well, you showed me this amazing, well, I don't want to call it a port, but it's a variation of Doom called Voxel Doom. That runs by, I believe it runs by way of one of these game engines that we were just talking about.
Yeah, it's a replacement game engine, exactly like that. Yeah.
And it provides in lovingly recreated, not like a modern reinterpretation, but it takes those 2D images and lovingly recreates them as true 3D objects. So whether it's a weapon, whether it's a box of ammo, whether it's a boss, whatever it is, the developer of this Voxel Doom recreated all the elements as true 3D objects that you can run around and observe from all different directions. and
yeah. It was phenomenal work. Isn't it?
it was
Yeah.
absolutely phenomenal work, and it was thanks to these game engines, and thanks to the work of someone who just absolutely loved Doom.
Yeah.
Now, I also wanted to point out that these game engines we're talking about that allow us, that have Apple Silicon native engines to run Doom or Quake or what have you on your Mac, there are also Intel native versions of these game engines too.
Well, yes,
They're not
absolutely,
exclusive
yeah.
to Apple Silicon. So if you are still on an Intel Mac, but you have a hankering to run Doom or Quake, you can
Yeah.
get one of these alternative game engines and run it on your Intel Mac as well.
That's actually one of the advantages to the tie-in with macOS and the Apple Silicon as well, and mainly not just Apple Silicon, but how macOS works with the new architecture. And this happened with the first processor transition, and has now happened with the second. And in theory, you could add all three together, but that would be probably a bit silly. But each application now on the Mac it is, unbeknownst to many users, actually two applications in one. They're fat binaries. So often you'll see that there is an Intel version of the binary inside the game that you run, together alongside an Apple Silicon version of running on ARM in the same package. So to the person running the application, they just double click it and it runs, whether you've got an Intel machine or an Apple Silicon machine, and it just uses the correct binary that matches the machine you're running on. That just makes it very, very easy for the user to just download and grab an app and run it, and not to care really whether they've got an Intel Mac or an Apple Silicon Mac. It'll just work.
Yeah, the universal apps, as they call them, right?
The universal apps,
Yeah.
There's no other system I know of that quite works that well or integrated in that way. Everything else is just a nightmare in comparison. The Mac just does it right.
All these staunch Windows users that poo-poo the Mac really don't understand the platform.
They don't know what they're missing.
No.
They have never used it. They don't understand what is really happening under the hood. And if they did, I think they would be far more impressed with it.
They'd probably be shocked, actually.
They would be. They would be floored. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, what's kind of interesting is Bill Gates had actually said something a while back. I think it was talking about Steve Jobs, but he had said when they switched from the PowerPC to Intel processor, he goes, I don't think people realize what a feat that was, and just everything that was involved. And he goes that was a technical, both a business and technical achievement that he goes was really just was underrated. And I'm sure it's still exactly the same for obviously going to Apple Silicon now. So it is kind of, it is amazing. Like you said, it's there is so much there. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say it was a feat of software engineering. To make something look that simple is actually very, very, very complex.
Right.
So,
and how many years has Microsoft been trying to complete their ARM version of Windows?
They haven't had much success. Although, to be fair, Apple has cheated slightly, because one of the things done in the Apple Silicon architecture is they've added some specific 8.6 decode hardware instructions in the instruction set that isn't actually there as part of the ARM official instruction set. So slight cheating there, because what they've got there is they've got hardware acceleration for any 8.6 based code to run. Microsoft hasn't got any of this acceleration help.
No, that's true.
So their own code running on their own ARM processor runs like a dog. But running that same code on a Mac that they've snuck in some very clever hardware-based 8.6 translations in the chip means it runs really, really quickly and sort of embarrasses Microsoft a little bit there.
And look, to be fair, x86 software running on an ARM-based version of Windows is pretty good too. That's pretty good.
They've done an excellent job.
They've done a good job with that.
Initially,
they have.
Initially, they did not support 64-bit. So it was a bit tricky there because you could only run 32-bit Windows apps on the initial set of ARM CPUs for Windows. But now they do support 64-bit as well as 32. So on their second go, they've done quite a good job. But it still doesn't run as well as it does on the Mac. So if you run an Intel copy of Windows, for instance, on a Mac, it runs better than it does on a PC. Running its own ARM processor, so their own translation doesn't work as fast.
Okay, now I want to jump onto something. I want to jump onto something here. Enough about Windows. I want to jump onto something here that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm pretty sure it's near and dear to your heart too, Darren, and that is emulators. In other words, running retro and classic games on the Mac. We've touched on this before when you were on the show. Look, all the wonderful things you can do with crossover, all the modern games you can run on the Mac. Sometimes you just want to run a good old, copy of Manic Miner or, Ant Attack or something like that. And if you don't know what those are, you're missing out, people. But tell us about that. Tell us about running retro games, and I don't know if you're including things like old Apple II apps here.
Oh yes.
If you're talking about Commodore, Sinclair, Atari, Atari 2600, whatever it is, there are great ways to run nearly any old school game or application on the Mac. Yeah,
this is one of the areas in gaming, especially. Where the Mac excels to a huge degree. You could probably say there are more actual emulators on Windows for old systems, but the highest quality and best ones also have a Mac version, a native Mac version, and you can. The world of emulators on the Mac is a vast, fun area to dive into. You can pretty much emulate anything you've ever heard of, some of the things you've never heard of, or perhaps actually I wonder if you can emulate a Texas Instruments TI-99 4A. Oh yeah, you can.
I think you can. I believe you can.
I think you can. Yeah. Or perhaps the Sword M5 and try to program in Forth with their specific cartridges you could plug in. You can emulate the cartridge structure on there. You could, as you're a Specky fan, you can also emulate the entire set of interfaces you could plug into a Spectrum. So all of those interfaces are hardware compatible too. And as I was saying earlier on, that the world's best programmers are programmers of emulators. One of the things they do is they have to write very tight timed code to be cycle correct in the timing structure of the cycles of what an older system would do. For instance, they would plot pixels on the screen and the time of the electron gun going from one edge of the screen to the end of the screen, and the vertical blank interrupt going to the next line to do all the visual effects on that is the only way to do visual effects on old 8-bit machines. Somebody on the Mac writing an emulator for a machine like that would have to write or be able to write a cycle correct, extremely tight timing loop, for instance, to try to emulate the actual hardware on those old systems. And the old systems hardware is quite slow, so that gives you ample space really on an Apple Silicon Mac, which has a processor that is many hundreds of thousands times faster than the system that it's trying to emulate. It's able to emulate the hardware precisely with precise timings just purely through software, which is an incredible programming feat. So the Spectrum's fairly easy to do because there's not much actual specific hardware chips to emulate. But where you've got a system that has lots of co-processors that have to run a cycle timing correct fashion to talk to each other, especially to do clever demo effects and various other complex things, you have to be the world's best programmer to pull off an emulator like that. So the most difficult ones would be, for instance, a timing correct Amiga emulator, which does exist. So you can get a vast array of emulators for classic systems to run on your Mac. And then you can, any of the games you were never able to complete when you were 12 years old, you can go back and game again and finally finish it.
Right.
I was going to say that talking to emulators, and I think probably Mike has this too, I don't know, but I've got a JavaScript emulator of macOS, or the System 7, essentially.
System 7, yeah.
Yeah. It just, and you launch it and you can actually copy files into it. And there's, I think, a version of Photoshop, whatever, I don't know. It's insane that it works at all, let alone works as well as it does. I mean, it's like, it's JavaScript, and there, I mean, nothing to take away from JavaScript, but you just, I don't know, it's amazing, and I think, like you said, right. Emulator programmers are huge. Yeah.
Once you could finish explaining what the internet was and what a web browser was and how a web browser worked and displayed information to the end user, and then explained what JavaScript was, now explain to the developers of the macOS in the 1980s what you could do and how you could run their operating system in a piece of software that's running within a piece of software that's running over this vast network of millions of computers around the world.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I don't even know if they could comprehend what you were.
No.
Well, they could certainly comprehend it, but I don't know if they could believe that you were telling them the truth.
Yeah. Well, one of the best programmers is a guy, a French guy. I think he's French anyway. I hope he's French. His name is Francois Lino. He made STOS and Amos back in the day, which were basic interpreters for the Amiga and Atari ST. And absolutely stunning environments, probably the best implementation of a language that's ever been written. And what he's done is he's made what's called a transpiler, which is a bit unusual. It's not. It doesn't translate code on the fly, and it doesn't compile. It does both. It's very, very intriguing. So what it does is it takes Amos code, as you would write into an Amiga, and it runs it through a transpiled version of what that would be compiled on a web page, but using JavaScript. So he's rewritten his own language to interpret his own code through two layers through JavaScript, and it's a feat of software engineering again. That's like incredible. I if I was a programmer anywhere near that caliber, I would say I am not worthy.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Darren. We talked about emulating the Spectrum and the Commodore and the Ataris and whatnot. What are some of your, if someone wanted to experiment with playing around with, old classic systems like those, BBC Micro is another one. What are some of your personal favorite emulators that you could recommend to somebody?
Excellent. Yes. Well, my personal favorites, that's the thing, on the Mac, that we're spoiled for choice. There are absolutely loads. So just a small smattering of something to get into to start you off. Firstly, I'd have a look at OpenEMU. That's an excellent emulator which doesn't emulate just one system, it emulates quite a few of them. And one of the favorites being the Mega Drive. Is that called the Mega Drive in the States, or
the Nintendo?
No,
about the Nintendo Mega Drive? Is that what it's
Sega
called?
Mega Drive.
Sega Mega Drive. You're right. You're right. Sega. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sega.
I think it was called the Mega Drive, wasn't it, Eric?
It's not ringing a bell.
It might have a different name in the States, perhaps, but that's one of the favorites. Just Sega's main machine back in the day, and that emulator, OpenEMU, has a great implementation of that. And I'd also recommend that if you download OpenEMU, if you download it's quite easy to get to from the menu. If you download the experimental version, that allows you to download and use arcade system ROMs and code.
MAME.
Yes, exactly, MAME, yeah. So it's a MAME emulator built into OpenEMU, but you have to download the experimental version to get that cabinet support. But that's a very good way to jump in. And there's another one for ZX Spectrum Amstrad CPC fans, the Retro Virtual Machine, and that's quite nice because it's native to Apple Silicon, so it's a very nice option to be able to have like a fully emulated system. So, for instance, you can even emulate the tape drive, and if you were so inclined, you could wait 10 minutes to load a game if you wanted to, because it will if you want to fully emulate the tape drive if you want. But I would probably skip that part.
Yep.
But if you were to tell the 12-year-old me when I was playing games on my Spectrum that 40 years down the road I'd be able to play the same game and it would load instantly, and what I would see now, I would definitely not believe myself. I think I was absolutely, completely lying.
Loading a game into the Spectrum from tape was excruciating.
It was painful.
It was painful, and it was worse when there was a tape error.
Oh God, start again.
And then when we got the micro drives, and which were essentially endless tape loops, those had their own issues. And if you were lucky enough to get a disk drive for the Spectrum,
oh wow,
oh my gosh, that was it was like a whole new world.
Luxury.
It was luxury to say the least. But yeah, all those systems, even the Commodore, they all had tape load systems, even though we know them as being disk based, but many of them had tape load systems on them.
Oh yeah. The Commodore 64 had a wonderful trick. It would play music, or sometimes even a little mini game, whilst it was loading. No other systems could do that. So sometimes I would even buy a Commodore 64 game because the loading music was so good. Before the game even started, the loading music was a pull just to buy the game. There's a guy called, you probably may not remember him, but a guy called Rob Hubbard, who is an extremely famous in the retro scene. He's an extremely famous composer, and he could pull out sounds from a Commodore 64 SID chip that would be like a full orchestra. Now, what he could do with that chip was stunning, and his compositions and his music were absolutely fantastic. And I'd often buy a game, not necessarily even knowing what the game's like, because it just had a Rob Hubbard soundtrack on it.
Just to listen to music.
But that's that's where you have to have an emulator that's very good at emulating the chips, because the SID chip, they're fairly easy to emulate, but there's two emulators for the Commodore 64 that are really good. There's one called Vice, which is a versatile Commodore emulator, and that emulates various Commodore machines, including the PET and so on, and some very old systems. But it does a good job of emulating the Commodore 64 with a cycle exact timing So you can run Commodore 64 demos and other things on there that are tricky to emulate. For instance, putting sprites in the border used to be a really difficult trick, but that emulator allows you to run Commodore 64 code that puts sprites in the border and does it correctly, as if the real machine did. It'll even emulate on scan lines from your old CRT TV and overlay them over the top and make it look like you've got an old curved CRT TV. It does a very good simulation of that as well. And there's another one called Frodo. So those two are my main emulators. There's only there is one more. There's one called ZXX SP, which I think you might particularly like, Mike, actually, because it's a very complete ZX Spectrum emulator with lots of extra hardware you can emulate and other things in there. The only downside to that one is it's not native to Apple Silicon, so it's an Intel app, but it does understand metal effects, and it does work perfectly fine on an Apple Silicon Mac. So it runs really well. So even though it's not native, it's worth looking at because it's a very, very good emulator.
Having been a Spectrum user, Darren, I'm reasonably certain that Rosetta 2 running on an Apple Silicon Mac can more than handle an Intel-based emulator of the Spectrum.
Easily. Yeah.
And whether it needs metal or not is also in question.
Yes, it only really would need metal for visual effects like the overlays and things with pretending to be CRTs and things like that. But yeah, exactly right. I think the original speed of a Spectrum was 3.5 megahertz, and that's about your average Apple Silicon Mac. Even the lowest end one is probably about 200,000 times faster than that.
And just to clarify, everyone. I'm just teasing you a little bit here, Darren. You referred to it as ZXSP. I know it. Others may know it as ZXSP. Just to clarify.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Now there are one you called OpenEMU. I've used that before. It is a fantastic platform to emulate old systems. The other one I wasn't familiar with, Retro Virtual Machine. Is that what you called it? Retro Virtual Machine?
That's right, yes. So a little bit getting used to because it's slightly different to how other emulators run. But essentially what it's doing is it's trying to emulate the whole system, the real thing. So you have to go in and type load and so on to load things in. You don't click a nice icon to load an app into it. You actually have to use the old 8-bit machine as if it was real sitting in front of you. So it's a little bit slightly different way to get used to using an emulator.
Now, if we leap ahead from the early 80s to the kind of late 80s, early 90s, and even up to the early 2000s, there's a couple emulators you listed here too that I think we should probably mention, and we have talked about before.
Okay.
But there's two in particular. You mentioned UTM and you mentioned DOSBox. DOSBox is great, especially for older games like the Apogee games, Commander Keen, Doom. Some, as I mentioned, Castle Wolfenstein. Some of the games that I played a lot of. Commander Keen being 2D platformers, which again I mentioned. I love those games. But all those games you can pretty much drop right into the folders of DOSBox and run them.
You can, yeah. This one I've got in the show notes here, or that I sent you a link to, is actually a slight variant of that, which is an enhanced version of DOSBox. So this is DOSBox X, which is specific to run better on Macs and Apple Silicon machines. So that's a nice experience. And one of the things that DOSBox does is emulate those very hard to configure things. So the old Sound Blaster configurations that you used to have to go through,
Oh man,
which were
Oh, yeah.
which I could see the pain now.
that was painful.
Oh,
It was a struggle, but yeah, it emulates those. So it's very easy for you to use Sound Blaster, DOS games, and those really old EGA compatible games and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
That makes it easy to run. So DOSBox X for the Mac is a really good specific version that's better running on Macs and Apple Silicon. So it's a good or a better version than DOSBox, but it's
Yep.
the same thing. But it's just optimized. It's very nice. Oh, and the other one you mentioned, which was UTM. Yeah, that's if you have a hankering for running older, simpler, not non-3D games, it won't really cope with 3D. Or it can't cope with 3D really, unless it's just very simple software rendering. UTM is very good because it makes the hard work of installing the emulator that it's based on very easy. So you can install and use UTM and put a copy of Windows XP on your machine, and you'll be able to install some nice, really old games into that. For instance, I think I had something I haven't done yet, but it's on my list to do. I have an old copy of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Yes.
For Windows XP. So strangely, I mean, getting that to run on a real Windows machine is nearly impossible. So it's actually much easier and nicer to get it to run on a Mac than it is to get it to run on a real Windows machine. Ironically, being a Windows game.
And if we're speaking about emulation, we should also point out that UTM does an amazing job of running old versions of classic macOS.
Indeed, yes.
Classic macOS.
PowerPC processors.
PowerPC,
will do those as well.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's a fantastic platform, and it'll even run. It is kind of, in a sense, a version of VMware Fusion or Parallels, but in a broader sense. It does not do a particularly good job of emulating x86 operating systems, as you pointed out. Older ones like XP probably run okay, but
it runs great. Yeah, XP does.
Windows 7 doesn't run. It runs, but not particularly well on Apple Silicon. But UTM running on an Intel Mac will run it just fine. And UTM will also run
there's one
ARM
less
versions.
translation layer to go through. Yeah,
it'll run ARM versions of operating systems, like ARM versions of Linux or even the ARM versions of Windows on an Apple Silicon Mac. So it's quite a versatile environment, and it's essentially free.
Yeah.
It's essentially free.
Yeah.
which is a good deal.
I mean, it is a good deal. It's also available on the Mac App Store as well.
Yes,
for a paid fee. That's quite nice in a way, although you can download and use the full thing for free on their website. It is quite a nice option if you're feeling particularly generous. If you buy it through the App Store, it's not a huge amount. It's only about £10 or so I'm not sure what it is in the States, but it's
about
£10
here.
Yeah. So that just gives some good support to the UTM developers, and it also gives you not like necessarily a forum as such, but a channel to talk to them, to say that if you're having a problem with something, you get some good support there. So you get possibly a little bit better support through that channel than if you just rely on the free one. But yeah, you can certainly download it for free and use it without any restrictions at all. But there is a nice option there to buy it through the Mac App Store. And one of the benefits of that is when you move from Mac to Mac, you can just go to the App Store and download all the things you would normally use on a machine. If you use it often and you go from Mac to Mac and you use multiple Macs, then it is nice to have the Mac App Store version of UTM in your list of things to download.
And I'll say that that's exactly what I did because I wanted to support the project, and that's essentially how I thought of it. There are lots of other advantages, as you pointed out, to buying it through the Mac App Store, but one of the reasons I did it, and especially for the low amount that they're asking for, is you know, it's a great way to support the project.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I want to skip ahead a little bit here. We had another topic that we were going to talk about, but I think I'd like to skip ahead here because I was thinking, what do you do when all else fails? When crossover isn't working for you, when you know, the emulator isn't working, when the game that you want to play just can't be played no matter what you try on the Mac directly through one means or another, there's something else you can do. And I know that you're somewhat of a fan of doing this, and that is
Yeah.
remote gaming.
Exactly. Yeah. That's quite a nice option, actually. Um, it also gives you an option, even if the game would work perfectly fine on your Mac. Um, it gives you another option. Um, for instance, I have a real PC, which shock horror. um, it's only a small little, very modest PC, and that's a micro form factor PC. It's quite small, but that lives over by my router, and it's just plugged into the router. So it's a real PC, but it's a very modest setup. It's not very good on the gaming front at all. Its graphics card is virtually non-existent. Um, but that gives you another route. So, for instance, if you don't want to involve all the hassle of hosting Windows games on your Mac to play, you can play them remotely. So you can install them on a real PC that happens to be lurking over in the other side of the room or in a closet somewhere, and you just remote onto that PC as using some specific software. The software, there's specific software I would recommend. There's the normal software that you would normally use would be Windows Remote Desktop, but there's another piece of software called Parsec, which is particularly impressive. Does some very interesting things. Effectively, it's double the speed of remote desktoping to a computer.
Wow.
So that speed doubling means it gives you an option for actually doing some full-on gaming, where the machine you're playing the game on isn't the machine you're sitting at. So it will stream that game from that real PC to your Mac, and in macOS Sonoma, it will turn on game mode automatically because
super cool.
it runs full screen. So that's very easy. It's just one click and you're in. Game mode starts. It maps itself into a virtual desktop and switches to it and turns on game mode. So in one click, you're all ready to go. And then you just run your game. And you can change the resolution dynamically as well. So if you've got, like, say for instance, I have an M1 iMac that has a 24-inch 4.5K display. So obviously my PC is far too weak to be able to play at that quality. So it will dynamically change the resolution. Even though it's playing full screen, it will dynamically change the resolution of the hosting machine to send it over to the Mac and resize it, but in a way that you don't even notice it happening. And it actually uses the hardware video compression on the graphics card of the PC to do all the hard work. So your Mac just has to decode the stream. So even if I run this wirelessly, although the PC itself is wired and plugged into the router, it's wirelessly talking to my Mac through the router. So it's only half wired system. It's still quite happily playable. So I can put this remote PC onto a 1080p display. I tried it with 1440p and that works quite well, actually, scarily enough, even though my PC is completely incapable of running at that speed, really. So I usually drop it down a bit to 1080p. So that gives you a wonderful setup whereby your Mac screen is 4.5K and your PC screen is 1K next to it, and you can just slide from one screen to the other and switch from Mac to PC in the middle of a game if you want to, and the whole game resources are being taken up by the PC, not on your Mac. So your Mac uses no resources at all. It uses no memory at all. Uses no. So there's no problem with. You could be playing a complex game, and your Mac would never even notice that it was doing it. So that's another nice option. That can be good as well from a price point of view, because buying a small form factor machine like that, a PC like that, you could get one second hand, for instance. You could call that, say, £200 worth or something, and just plug that in with a cable to your router, and you're pretty much done and dusted. Although you do have to maintain Windows then as well, which is another another thing altogether.
Right.
But it can work out cheaper than buying all of the software you may need to host and run those Windows apps on your Mac, and have your Mac going through the trouble of using up its RAM and its hard disk space and so on, when you could just farm that off to another little box plugged into your router. So there's two options there, and it can work out to be a similar price. So it's, for instance, if you don't fancy the idea of buying crossover and extra storage on your Mac, because Windows games are big.
They're big.
Very, very big.
Yes, they are.
So if you don't want to pay for lots and lots of storage on your Mac, for instance, you could just host it remotely on a little gaming rig plugged into your router, and it'll cost you a similar amount. Well, actually, it might be cheaper because you won't have to buy the extra resources you'd need for your Mac to be able to host and play Windows games.
Now, to make sure I understand, you mentioned it's a relatively underpowered PC. Is the PC okay? Is the PC streaming the game from an online service itself?
Nope.
It's playing the game.
The PC is hosting the game itself. It's just about fast enough with the terrible graphics card that I've got on the PC. It's just about fast enough to be playable, so I can play. For instance, I was playing Halo Remastered, which isn't available for the Mac.
Right.
So that was being played, hosted on the PC, using my absolutely terrible graphics card. But it still was quite a nice experience, about 30 frames per second or so, on my Mac screen as a 1080p screen, and it feels as if you're playing the game through your Mac, but your Mac is just streaming the results. So it's almost like having your own game streaming service.
Wow.
You're hosting your own game streaming service. So it's actually quite a nice little option.
That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. Speaking of costs, so it can be expensive to be a PC gamer. It can be very expensive.
Wow.
And we talked
Absolutely.
about the performance advantages that an Apple Silicon Mac can have over a high-end gaming PC. Obviously, it's not always one-to-one, but I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the cost differences between the two, especially if you're looking to jump into this fresh. Looking at the numbers you came up with, it can be quite expensive when compared to something like an M2 Ultra Mac Studio. You know, so
that's right. Yeah.
What kind of consideration should someone keep in mind as they're looking to buy something that they're going to use for gaming? And by that, I mean, should they look at a gaming PC? What kind of cost considerations are there for a gaming PC versus cost considerations for a Mac that they're going to use for gaming, even if it's not dedicated to it?
Yeah. I think it all depends on what sort of games, if you're a gamer, that you want to run. So if many of the games you want to partake in are going to be natively available to the Mac. That's great because you can get away with a Mac system that's half the cost of what you would normally spend. Having said that, PC gamers are very, very used to spending a huge amount of money on their gaming rigs.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I find it quite funny. They don't seem to bat an eyelid when they say, "Oh, I need a new graphics card. How much is that going to be?" "Oh, only £800." So okay, do that twice, and you come to the cost of what my Mac cost, just for 2 upgrades. And Windows gamers upgrade their systems a fair bit. They might think, "Oh, this I'll spend £50 extra on this RAM because it's got some flashy lights on it."
That's exactly it, right? Yes, if you want the fancy LED lights, I guess you don't really have an option but to go the PC route.
Well, there's that. But if you are a gamer, one of the things that you might be put off buying a Mac in the first place because people assume that the Mac isn't for gaming when it's easily powerful enough to do that. But that's mainly for running games natively that's been properly ported to the Mac. So if you're happy in that world and you want to stick to just games made for the Mac, then you have a very good option of buying an inexpensive Mac to enjoy gaming with. Even some of the lowest end Macs, like the one I've got.
Right.
Yeah, so not very expensive at all. But if you did want to play Windows games, and you use the knowledge we've got now to say that the experience isn't anywhere near as bad as you might have thought. So, say for instance, in Cyberpunk 2077, in the older version of Crossover, you used to get on an expensive Mac. So say you were talking about an M3, a nice new M3 16 MacBook Pro. That would be a sort of like a top of the range. You could get 50 odd frames per second, which is respectable for that game, running an unmodified Windows game. So that's very good, and it's one of the most complex games to run. It pushes systems, so it pushes real PCs to the edge as well. So that's a respectable number of frames per second that you wouldn't have thought you'd be able to run an unmodified Windows game on a Mac, even an M3 one. Sorry, an M3 Max, I should say. But with the recent version of Crossover, I know you haven't had a chance to play with it yet, and nor have I actually, because it was only released yesterday.
Yeah, I did install it on one Mac, but I have not done a whole lot with it yet. Yeah.
But the most impressive thing, and I think it's also down to the new version of Wine as well, has made a big difference. And the new translation layers for graphics, that's all been combined into the new Crossover. And now, instead of 50 frames per second on an M3 Max, you get 75 frames per second. So that's quite a substantial jump. And there are quite a few mid-range to high-end PCs that also get around 75 frames per second when playing Cyberpunk 2077. So you're talking about equal performance there, really. One system that was designed to run the game, running it roughly at a similar speed as another system that was never designed to run the game, which is very impressive.
That's super impressive. And one of the new features of Wine 9 that really stood out at me, since we're talking about that, is the new ARM64 support for 32-bit x86 emulation. That's now that's baked into Wine. Yeah. It
makes a big difference. But looking at the prices of systems, I'd say the Macs are actually cheaper. So if you were put off buying a Mac as a Windows gamer, thinking I can't transition over to using a Mac because I'm too embedded in Windows gaming, that's not entirely true. You can get very good performance. And price-wise, it's I still find it quite funny that almost all PC users try to say that the Mac's a no-go because it's too expensive. But we actually look at the numbers, it doesn't add up. Because I looked up the prices of a couple of systems that won the performance prizes from which magazine? There we are. Yes, the PC Pro magazine is an excellent magazine. Shout out to PC Pro. They have a section in their magazine called the A list, which is a list of the best systems in their areas. And the PC that won the best PC gaming laptop is the Asus ROG Zephyrus M16 Core i9 4090. So
good machine.
The price of that, it rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? The price of that PC is £4,100. So the equivalent Mac to run, even running unmodified Windows games on that same machine, the equivalent Mac would be the MacBook Pro M3 Max, which is quite a beefy beefy Mac, using 16 cores, 40 CPU cores. 16 CPU cores and 40 GPU cores. The price of that is £4,090. So actually, you're saving £10 by buying the Mac instead of the PC. Yeah. So everyone that says that's just an example. There's several other examples, but that's just an example of where people say Macs are way too expensive. When you look at the equivalent, comparing like with like, the Mac is actually a cheaper option often.
Well, and I'll go one better, only because you sent me these specs before we started recording, and so I thought, well, all right, let's see what 4,100 pounds translates to in US dollars, and that's $5,199. Now, yep, I don't know if this is a standalone machine that you can purchase. I don't know enough about the Asus ROG Zephyrus to know if this is something that's available just as a standalone machine in the US, or if it's, if I have to do the currency conversion like that. But doing the currency conversion, 4,100 pounds translates to $5,199. Conversely, the MacBook Pro M3 Max is not just $10 difference in price. That is $3,999 direct from Apple. So if that works out correctly, we're talking not just a 10-pound difference. We're talking about $1,000, $1,200 difference between the two. Now,
there may be a slight difference there with because we've got sales tax included as well.
You have the VAT included, correct? Yeah, and on top of that, this may be available in US dollars here in the States, and I did not bother to look it up. I just did the straight currency conversion on it. So that's not particularly fair, but it's fun. It may not be fair, but it's fun to point out how big of a difference it is. And it can be quite a bit different in price. You also mentioned the Chill Blast Apex.
That's right, yeah.
That's a Ryzen 9. And that one was 4,400 pounds. And again, you compared that to a Mac Studio M2 Ultra, which is coincidentally also 3,999 pounds. So apparently, if you want a decent gaming Mac, you're going to pay 3,999 pounds for it.
Oh, yes,
I'm sorry, $3,999. See, I'm stuck in the UK there. $3,999 for that. Yeah, that.
I mean, gaming is expensive, whichever system you choose.
Yeah.
If you choose a PC, it's expensive. If you choose a Mac, it's expensive.
It is.
It's almost as expensive as photography and all those lenses.
Oh my gosh, the lenses. Thank you, Darren. This has been great. It was a great way to kind of go through what the current state of gaming is on the Mac. how we can run some modern, what we would consider Windows games on the Mac. All different kinds of ways to do that,
Yeah.
whether it be Whisky or whether it be crossover, or whether we hope that there's going to eventually be a native port thanks to Apple's game porting toolkit. Not to mention
Yeah.
all the awesome retro emulators and ways that I can stay entertained. I don't know if the folks listening would stay entertained with that, but I can stay entertained for hours with all these retro emulators. So this is fantastic, and you have pointed me to ZXSP in the past, and I've installed it, and it's fantastic. So I really appreciate you
I'm glad you're
coming
enjoying
on
that one.
to talk about that. Now, I kind of sprung this on you before we started recording. As I've mentioned on the show before, in the last few episodes, we've been doing a bonus essential app. Now, when we did the essential apps episode in January, we realized that we had so many apps that we wanted to talk about that we figured, hey, well, let's just do a bonus essential app every episode for the rest of the year. We'll just see if we can make that happen. And when Barry was on, I put him on the spot and said, "Hey Barry, what is your bonus essential app?" And he went with SetApp, actually. Now, it's interesting because what you kind of gave me a preview, what you're going to go with. I put you on the spot and I said, "Would you come up with an essential app this episode?" And what you came up with is actually SetApp adjacent. So
It is indeed.
why don't you tell folks what your bonus essential app is this week and how it fits into your workflow?
Cool. My essential app is one that you've probably already covered before, but I've got a little story to go with it, and also a setting I use within that app that I'm not sure if very many people know about, which might be quite interesting. But my essential app is CleanMyMac X. Now, normally, I'm very careful about software that says it can clean up and speed up your computer as if by magic. It's like, okay, what are you actually doing? So I discovered this through the excellent video courses service that Screencast Online highlighted this.
Excellent service.
And very, very good. Yeah, I've learned a lot from Don McAllister there. Shout out to Don. So he went into depth with it, and that prompted me to look into it myself. So I used to do a spring clean and maintain my Mac manually, the old-fashioned way,
Sure.
in depth. I did it in the terminal, and it took me hours. I only did it once a year because it was quite painful, but I could spend 4 hours doing this job once a year. And CleanMyMac X actually did an awful lot of the manual cleanups that I would normally do myself, plus a few things more. And it does it in seconds, so it's really nice. But one of the main reasons I discovered it being an essential app was a problem it sorted for me when I was on my Mac at work. I had a problem with my Mac not being able to shut down, and having various other issues, and knowing the Mac quite well, I thought I'd investigated every issue and where an issue could live and what the problem was. But I could never find it. I could never fix it. I couldn't fix it at all. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to wipe this because I'm not getting anywhere. But I put CleanMyMac on it, and it managed to find an orphan item that was linked to a webcam that I'd used in the past, but had then taken off and it hadn't uninstalled properly, and it left behind various items that it shouldn't need. So CleanMyMac is excellent at doing something like this. It can go through, it can find orphan files from applications you've got rid of and that haven't been uninstalled properly, and then cause the system to be unstable and do all sorts of fun things. So 2 clicks later, and CleanMyMac cleaned up the offending orphan files, 1 restart, and all the problems were gone. And at that point, it was like, okay, this has now become essential software. I'm going to have this on every Mac I have from this point onwards. It's going to be probably one of the first things I install. So it's been a very impressive tool. And there's one thing that it can do that many people may not realize. One of the things it can do, because I tend to drill into the settings rather than just doing an overview. And in the system, there's a thing it can do, which is to get rid of the binaries for the apps that your system doesn't support, which can be quite a nice little option. Because one of the things that is a slight downside, I suppose, in a way, for a fat binary, although it's very versatile, it takes up a little bit more RAM. So when you run an application that contains both binaries, they sit in RAM, and it chooses which one to run. So if CleanMyMac cleans out the binaries that your system doesn't use, apps launch faster and they use a little bit less RAM. So that's something that was new to me until I discovered that, and it was quite interesting. So now my system, when I run an app runs a lot quicker, less bounces. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen an app bounce anymore since I've moved to Apple Silicon, so that's even better. But with that also, if you do that to quite a few apps that you run, you end up overall having a little bit less RAM used, clearing out binaries for things that your system doesn't use.
It's amazing. And I am starting to wonder if CleanMyMac X will actually take care of the sleeping problem I have with this Mac right here. And that's a discussion to have at another time, but it's been a frustration, an unending frustration for months now. I come this close to a solution and then realize that wasn't quite it. And I stumble across something else that might be a solution, and that's not quite it. But when you mentioned that old bit of software that CleanMyMac X found, cleaned up and fixed up your issues with the Mac, I started wondering, maybe that's what I need to take a look at myself. Now, and we'll point out too, the reason I said it's set app adjacent is because it's from the awesome folks at MacPaw. And MacPaw are not only the developers of CleanMyMac X, but also the developers of SetApp. So if you have a SetApp subscription, CleanMyMac X comes with it. So great way to go with that. Great way to go with that. Well, thanks so much, Darren. And I think that is going to do it for this episode of For Mac Guys Only. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Remember, I do love to get your letters. So if you have any comments about the show, a tip to share, or a software or hardware problem with your Mac, you could use CleanMyMac X, or you can leave your thoughts in the comments of this week's show notes found at formaceyersonly.com. Or, of course, you can always drop me a line, mike@formaceyersonly.com. And be sure to subscribe to the show's YouTube channel at youtube.com/FMEOTV. Click that little notification bell and you can find out when we're going live. You can join the chat room and catch all the behind the scenes stuff that doesn't make the final cut of the show. And I'm just going to do a quick shout out right now to Brian and Brett, who joined us in the chat room today. It was good to see you guys today. And Brian is saying himself that he's got some great ideas to check out some of his old favorites on his modern hardware. So that's awesome.
Excellent.
Yeah, and specifically he says he wants to run Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and Escape Velocity.
Oh, yes. I think Heroes is on the list.
There you go. There you go. Hey, Darren, if someone wants to reach out to you and maybe ask you a couple questions about gaming on the Mac, is there a way for them to get a hold of you?
I tend to lurk around on social media reasonably anonymously, but I don't know if you have a facility for a question to be routed, and through to my email, that would be perfectly fine.
that is a perfect way to go. If anyone would like to get a hold of Darren and ask him a couple questions, send me an email, mike@formacsonly.com, and I'll make sure he gets it.
No worries.
Eric has had to step out for a moment, so if you would like to reach Eric to ask him any questions, he can always be reached at eric@formacsonly.com. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Thanks to Eric and Darren for joining me this episode. Stay subscribed, and we'll talk to you next time. And now, Darren, because Eric has stepped out, you get the honor of saying, cue the music.
Cue the music.
Cueing music. Bye, everyone. Talk to you next time.